Michael Alig. In April of 1996, a group of children playing along the Staten Island shoreline noticed something heavy that had washed up in the tide. It was a cardboard box, waterlogged and battered, and inside it was the torso of a man. There was no head. There were no arms or legs. It would take investigators several weeks to identify the remains. But when they finally did, the trail led straight back to a man whose name and face had filled the New York nightlife scene of the mid-1990s. Michael Alig was born on April 29, 1966, in South Bend, Indiana. He was the second of two sons in a middle-class household, and there was nothing about his early life that suggested where he would end up. In his late teens, he moved to New York City, and within a few years he had rebuilt himself entirely. He went to work for a club owner named Peter Gatien at the Limelight, a converted Manhattan church that had become a major fixture of the New York nightclub scene. And it was there that Alig assembled the group of young performers, dancers, and self-styled personalities that made him famous. They called themselves the Club Kids. The Club Kids threw parties in unexpected locations. They wore elaborate costumes. They cultivated a level of outrage that eventually pulled them onto national television talk shows in the early 1990s. Alig was the ringleader. The Limelight had become the epicenter of a scene that revolved almost entirely around him. Behind the surface, though, the picture was different. Drugs moved through the clubs constantly. By 1996, Alig himself was deep into heroin addiction. One of the people who supplied him was a fellow club kid named Andre Melendez, known in the scene as Angel. Melendez was in his mid-20s, originally from Colombia, and he had been part of the Limelight crowd for years. He was also owed a substantial sum of money. On the night of March 17, 1996, Melendez came to Alig's apartment at Riverbank West in Hell's Kitchen to collect on that debt. Also in the apartment was Alig's roommate, a man named Robert Riggs, who went by the nickname Freeze. What began as an argument turned into a fight, and during the fight, Riggs struck Melendez in the head with a hammer. Alig then held Melendez down and helped suffocate him. When it was over, Melendez was dead inside the apartment. They did not call the police. Instead, they left the body in the bathtub for several days, poured Drano into the tub to accelerate decomposition, and then dismembered it. The legs were placed into one bag. The rest of the remains were placed into a cardboard box. Alig and Riggs carried the box and the bag down to the Hudson River, and they threw both into the water. For weeks, no one connected the disappearance of Andre Melendez to the two men in the apartment where he had last been seen. Alig continued going out. He continued hosting parties. Rumors began circulating through the club scene that he had killed someone, but investigators had no body and no physical evidence. That changed when the box washed up on Staten Island in April of 1996, and the medical examiner slowly began the work of identifying who the remains belonged to. The process took weeks. There was no head to work from, no dental records to easily compare against, and no immediate way of matching the torso to any missing persons report already on file. But once Melendez's identity was finally confirmed, the trail of rumors from inside the club scene became the trail investigators followed straight to Alig's apartment. So how does a man at the center of New York nightlife, protected by fame, protected by connections, and protected by an entire network of friends across the city, finally end up answering for what he had done? Alig and Riggs were both arrested late in 1996. Alig was held in New York City custody while the case moved through the court system. In October of 1997, he pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter. Riggs entered the same plea. Each of them received a sentence of 10 to 20 years, and Alig was transferred out of the city and into the New York State prison system to serve his time. He would spend the next 17 years moving between state facilities upstate, eventually settling at Mid-State Correctional Facility in Marcy. During his years inside, he corresponded with journalists, gave occasional interviews, and became the subject of books, a feature film, and multiple documentaries. Robert Riggs was released on parole in 2010. Alig himself was conditionally released on May 5, 2014, and he finished parole in 2017. Life outside prison did not go well. Alig struggled publicly with addiction. He gave interviews claiming he was clean, then relapsed, then tried again. He lived in a small apartment in Washington Heights and tried to rebuild a version of the life he had once dominated, but the scene he had helped create no longer existed. On Christmas Eve of 2020, shortly before midnight, Michael Alig was found dead inside his apartment. He was 54 years old. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death an accidental heroin overdose. Andre Melendez was 33 years old when he died. His family has spoken publicly over the years about how his killing has often been overshadowed in the media by fascination with the man who committed it. Melendez, they have said, is remembered by his relatives not as a figure in a nightclub story, but as a son and a brother. The Alig case has been the subject of books, a feature film, and multiple documentaries in the years since. It became a defining marker of the excess of the New York nightlife scene at the tail end of the 20th century. And in the decades since the conviction, it has continued to be publicly discussed, often more for the man behind it than for the man whose life was taken. The next case moves forward almost 3 decades, to a Christmas morning inside one of the busiest transit hubs in the world, and to a man whose passage through Rikers Island lasted only a few days before he did something that put an entire housing unit on alert. Stephen Hutcherson. On Christmas Day of 2023, a family visiting from Paraguay walked into a restaurant inside Grand Central Terminal to have lunch. Within minutes, a man they had never met before crossed the dining area and attacked them without warning. 2 young sisters in the family were among those harmed. The attacker surrendered without resistance and was taken into custody by police. And 3 days later, inside a Rikers Island housing unit meant specifically for newly admitted detainees, he would do something almost identical to what he had just done at the restaurant. The attacker was known to law enforcement under 2 names. His legal name is Esteban Esono Asuo. He was also known by the name Stephen Hutcherson. At the time of the attack, he was 36 years old, and he had a long history with the criminal justice system in New York. He had accumulated 17 prior arrests. He had been arrested twice more just in the 6 months leading up to Christmas Day. In police records, he was classified as an emotionally disturbed person, and he had been cycling in and out of the system for years without any meaningful intervention. Officers with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority Police, the NYPD, and multiple precincts across Manhattan had all encountered him at various points before Christmas morning. Around 11:30 in the morning on December 25, 2023, Hutcherson walked into the Tartnary restaurant on the dining concourse at Grand Central Terminal. Sitting at one of the tables was a family of tourists who had traveled to New York for the holiday. Without any prior interaction, Hutcherson approached them. He scratched one of the women in the family across the neck with a fork. He then produced a knife and harmed 2 of the young sisters in the family before dropping the weapon on the ground. Witnesses in the restaurant told investigators that during the attack, Hutcherson made statements expressing hatred toward white people. He did not attempt to flee. He waited for police to arrive and was taken into custody without incident. Every member of the family survived. Hutcherson was held without bail and transferred to Rikers Island. He was processed into the Eric M. Taylor Center the facility on the island that receives newly admitted detainees. He was screened on arrival per standard Department of Correction protocol. But whatever the screening turned up, it failed to identify one item that he had somehow managed to bring inside the jail with him. It was a ceramic blade, roughly 1.5 inches long. On the morning of December 28, 2023, around 8 in the morning, Hutcherson rose from his cot inside the housing area. He walked over to another detainee, a man he did not know, and slashed him across the left side of his face and head. A correction officer working the unit intervened with pepper spray. The other detainee was transported off the island to Elmhurst Hospital, where he was treated for serious wounds that were not considered life-threatening. The Department of Corrections spokesman at the time, Frank Dwyer, confirmed the incident publicly and said that Hutcherson would be processed for a new arrest on top of the charges he was already facing. Inside the department, the incident raised urgent questions. How had a man screened at intake managed to bring a weapon into a general housing unit? A senior source inside the Department of Correction later told the New York Post that Hutcherson should never have been placed with the general population in the first place, that his documented history of mental illness and prior violence should have routed him directly to a mental observation unit. In the days after the attack, he was moved to segregated housing. So how does a person with 17 prior arrests, a documented pattern of escalating violence, and a formal classification as an emotionally disturbed person end up on Christmas morning inside a crowded terminal, unsupervised, and carrying a weapon? Hutcherson was initially charged with attempted murder and assault as hate crimes, along with endangering the welfare of a minor. His case moved through the New York State court system in Manhattan. The prosecution was handled by the Office of District Attorney Alvin Bragg. He was represented by defense attorney Michael Feynman. In June of 2024, a jury convicted him of assault and other related charges. He was later sentenced in Manhattan State Court under his legal name Esteban Esono Asue to a term of 26 to 29 years in prison. The conviction was only the most recent of several against him. Earlier, in December of 2023, he had pleaded guilty in a separate matter to a prior assault charge, receiving only a conditional discharge. He had also pleaded guilty to weapons possession charges from arrests in July and November of 2023. None of those prior convictions had removed him from the streets for any meaningful length of time before Christmas morning. As of 2026, Esteban Esono Asue is incarcerated inside the New York State prison system, serving his 26 to 29-year sentence. The Paraguayan family he attacked returned home. The correction officer who intervened at Rikers on December 28th was not seriously injured. The other detainee recovered from his wounds, and the Internal Department of Correction review that opened after the ceramic blade was recovered from the housing unit produced changes in how newly admitted detainees are searched on arrival at the Eric M. Taylor Center. Search protocols were tightened. The unit's approach to housing detainees flagged as emotionally disturbed was reviewed, and the review process itself was cited in later Department of Correction reports on how weapons continue to enter the housing units. The next case takes us back to the late 1990s, to an 82-year-old widow living quietly in an Upper East Side townhouse, and to a mother and son con artist team whose scheme to steal her home ended in her disappearance. Kenneth Kimes, Jr. In the summer of 1998, an elderly Manhattan widow named Irene Silverman vanished from inside her own townhouse. She had rented a room to a young man who called himself Manny, and one day, without warning, both the tenant and Silverman were gone. Investigators searched the house and recovered no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, and no body. What they did find Buried inside the tenant's belongings and later inside his mother's car was a paper trail of forgeries and notebooks, pointing to a scheme that had been months in the making. The tenant's real name was Kenneth Kimes, Jr., and by the time he was identified, he and his mother were already sitting in New York custody. Kenneth Kimes, Jr., known to his mother as Kenny, was born on March 24, 1975, in Los Angeles. His father was a wealthy motel owner. His mother, Sante Kimes, was a career con artist with a criminal record that stretched back decades and included accusations of insurance fraud, slavery of undocumented workers, and multiple suspected killings. Kenny was pulled out of traditional schooling as a child and raised entirely inside his mother's world. By the time he was in his teens, he was a full participant in her schemes, traveling with her, using aliases with her, and helping her operate the network of forged documents and shell identities she had built her life around. By the summer of 1998, Sante had settled on the most ambitious target of her career. Irene Silverman was an 82-year-old widow living alone in a townhouse near Central Park, worth approximately $7 million. Sante's plan was to forge the paperwork, transferring the property into her own name, and then simply take the house. To carry it out, she needed her son inside the building. He rented a room from Silverman under the name Manny. On July 5, 1998, Irene Silverman disappeared from her own home. Her staff reported her missing that same day. Her body has never been recovered. What investigators did recover, tucked away in her tenant's belongings and later inside his mother's car, was the paper trail, the forged documents, the notebooks, and the aliases that tied both Kimes and his mother directly to the disappearance. But the Silverman case was not the only killing Kenneth Kimes, Jr. was eventually connected to. In 2004, as part of a separate plea deal in California, he confessed to the 1996 killing of a Los Angeles businessman named David Kasdan, who had been shot in the back of the head. During the same proceedings, he also acknowledged that he and his mother had been responsible for the death of a banker named Syed Bilal Ahmed in the Bahamas that same year, a man they had drowned inside a hotel bathtub. He was never formally charged in the Ahmed case. The Silverman case went to trial in New York, and both Kimes and his mother were held at Rikers Island throughout their pre-trial detention and the trial itself. His attorneys have said publicly that his time on Rikers was one of the most difficult stretches of his life. But the incident most people associate with his time in New York custody actually happened after his conviction, once he had been transferred upstate. On October 10, 2000, at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, Kimes was being interviewed by a court TV freelance producer named Maria Zone. During the interview, he grabbed her, put a ballpoint pen to her throat, and refused to release her. He demanded that his mother not be extradited to California to face the Kasdan charges. Prison negotiators worked for nearly 4 hours before securing Zone's release. She was not physically injured. Kimes was placed in an observation cell and then moved to a disciplinary housing unit, where he spent the next long stretch of his sentence locked down 23 hours a day. So how does a mother and son con team that had operated for decades in plain sight, running scheme after scheme without ever being caught for a killing, finally lose control of a plan that had worked so many times before? In the year 2000, mother and son were tried together in New York on a combined 118 charges connected to the Silverman case. After a 13-week trial, both were convicted. On June 27, 2000, Kenneth Kimes, Jr. was sentenced to a term commonly reported as 125 years, a sentence designed to guarantee that he would die in prison. His appeal was ultimately rejected in a 2006 ruling from a New York State appellate court. In 2004, Kemes agreed to a plea deal in the David Kasdan case. In exchange for testifying against his mother and pleading guilty to second-degree murder, he was allowed to avoid the California death penalty. He received an additional life sentence. As of 2026, Kenneth Kimes Jr. is still incarcerated, but he is no longer a New York inmate. He was transferred to Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility near San Diego, the same facility that currently houses Eric and Lyle Menendez and Marion Suje Knight. In November of 2024, he gave a rare on-camera interview to CNN from inside the prison. His mother, Sante Kimes, died at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York on May 19, 2014. She was 79 years old. Irene Silverman's remains have never been found. In the years since her disappearance, a small group of Silverman's former staff members have continued to speak publicly about her and about the townhouse she owned for more than 4 decades. The scheme that Sante and Kenneth Kimes Jr. built to steal it from her remains one of the strangest attempted property takeovers in New York City history. The next case moves forward more than a decade and centers on a housing unit inside Rikers that no longer exists, and on the near-fatal attack of a correction officer named Raymond Calderon. Darnell Green. On the afternoon of November 5, 2015, inside a Rikers Island jail unit called the George Machen Detention Center, a correction officer named Raymond Calderon was walking his usual post when an inmate approached him from behind. The inmate slipped an arm around Calderon's neck and pulled him backwards into a chokehold. A second inmate stepped in front of him with a homemade blade. The seconds that followed inside that housing unit would set off a march of roughly 200 correction officers on City Hall, trigger a Department of Correction lockdown of the entire jail complex, and lead to consecutive prison sentences for both attackers. The primary attacker was a 19-year-old detainee named Darnell Green. He was a member of the Bloods, and at the time of the attack, he was awaiting trial on a murder charge out of Queens. That murder charge stemmed from an incident earlier that same year, when Green had shot a teenager named Isaiah Lee in the face and chest. Lee, whose friends called him Magic, was 18 years old, and he had answered the door of his family's apartment inside the Charlton Manor houses moments before he was killed. Green had been at Rikers for months awaiting trial, and in the time he had been there, he had already accumulated a record of jailhouse incidents. In August of 2015, he was accused of striking a correction officer. In March of that same year, he had reportedly thrown an unknown substance at another officer inside the same jail. His presence on the tier was known to the housing unit staff, and his gang affiliation was documented in the department's own internal records. The second attacker was an 18-year-old inmate named William Whitfield. Whitfield had been detained at Rikers on a separate weapons charge, and according to court records from later proceedings, had a background overlapping with Green's from outside the jail. The two had known each other before their paths crossed inside the George Machen Detention Center, and correction officers with knowledge of the housing unit told reporters later that the coordination between the two attackers on November 5th appeared to have been prearranged. According to a later press release from the Bronx District Attorney's Office, Green approached Officer Calderon from behind and pulled him into the chokehold. Whitfield stepped in from the front with the blade. Whitfield slashed Calderon across the face, from cheek to ear, and then cut him across the arm as Calderon tried to defend himself. Calderon later said publicly that he came close to losing consciousness inside the chokehold, and that if he had blacked out, he believed the wounds could easily have been fatal. Other officers reached the scene and intervened. Calderon was transported off the island and treated at a hospital. The wounds required 20 stitches to his left cheek and 4 stitches to his wrist. The scar on Calderon's face would remain visible for the rest of his career, a permanent reminder of the attack. He would later speak publicly about the moment inside the chokehold when he thought he was going to lose consciousness, and about the recovery process that followed. Officers on the shift with him that day gave statements to investigators describing how quickly the assault escalated once the two attackers moved on him at the same time. Their accounts, together with the surveillance footage from the housing area, formed the core of the case the Bronx District Attorney's Office would eventually bring. The attack ignited a public reaction from the union representing New York City correction officers. Roughly 200 officers marched on New York City Hall in the days that followed. The president of the Correction Officers Benevolent Association at the time, Norman Seabrook, held press conferences demanding that violent detainees be housed differently and that intake screening be tightened. The commissioner of the Department of Correction at the time, Joseph Ponte, ordered a jail-wide lockdown and a top-to-bottom search for contraband weapons across the housing units. The George Machen Detention Center where the attack took place has since been closed, part of a broader plan to eventually shut down the entire Rikers Island jail complex. So what does the criminal justice system actually do with a 19-year-old already facing a murder charge, who then chooses to nearly kill a correction officer on his way to trial? Green pleaded guilty on June 4, 2018. On July 19, 2018, Bronx Supreme Court Justice Ralph Fabrizio sentenced him to a term of 9 years for the attack on Calderon. That sentence was ordered to be served consecutively to a sentence he was already serving. According to the Bronx District Attorney's Office, that existing sentence consisted of 25 years for manslaughter and 4 years for attempted robbery. His co-defendant, William Whitfield, had been sentenced 3 months earlier, in April of 2018, to a term of 11 years, also ordered to run consecutively to a 9-year weapons sentence he was already serving. Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark said publicly after the sentencing that the case laid out a stark picture of the culture of violence inside Rikers, and that gang members inside the jail should not be allowed to believe they controlled the facilities. The family of Isaiah Lee lost their son at 18 years old. Officer Raymond Calderon returned to duty following his recovery. The Correction Officers Benevolent Association would continue to point back to the Calderon attack in the years that followed as evidence of what happens when weapons are not intercepted at intake, and when detainees with violent histories are placed in general housing. As of 2026, Darnell Green remains in the custody of the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, with more than 3 decades left on his combined sentence. The specific facility where he is currently held has not been publicly confirmed in available reporting. The next case follows a man whose spree lasted only a matter of days across 3 New York City boroughs, and whose 2 years inside Rikers after his surrender became one of the department's most watched files. If you're enjoying this so far and you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. It really helps the channel grow and keep making these videos. Sundance Oliver. In late 2022, a young man in his late 20s walked into the 77th Precinct in Brooklyn and surrendered himself to police. He had a tattoo across his face reading the words, "Rich Forever," a Superman logo on his neck, and 31 prior arrests on his record. Over the previous days, he had moved across 3 New York City boroughs on what investigators would eventually describe as a one-man crime wave. 2 people were dead. Others had been wounded or robbed. And once he arrived at Rikers Island, correction officers would come to know him not for those crimes, but for what he did to them over the 2 years that followed. Sundance Oliver had been running with street gangs since his early teens. By the time of his surrender, he was a reputed member of the Loop Gang, a Bloods-linked crew operating out of the Pink Houses in East New York, Brooklyn. His arrest record went back years and included a 2010 gang assault charge and a 2012 weapons possession charge, He had himself been shot in drug-related incidents in 2012 and in 2013. And at the time of the 2022 crime spree, he was on parole from a 2015 felony robbery conviction, having served roughly 5 years upstate. The Pink Houses complex, where the Loop Gang was rooted, had been the site of multiple gang-related incidents in the years before Oliver's 2022 spree. Members of the crew had been tied to shootings, robberies, and internal disputes that had drawn NYPD attention on and off across the previous decade. Oliver's role within that structure was, according to law enforcement sources cited in local press coverage, that of a senior participant with a long-standing reputation for violence inside the neighborhood. The spree began around November 21, 2022, and escalated over the first week of December. According to prosecutors, Oliver crossed the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Manhattan over the course of several days. During that stretch, he took the lives of 2 people. The first was a 21-year-old man named Kevin Langston. The second was a young woman named Keira Rattray. In Crown Heights, he shot and wounded a 96-year-old man who was seated in a wheelchair. He committed robberies. He was accused of a domestic assault. Prosecutors later said that during his interviews with detectives, Oliver told them he had planned to open fire on an NYPD precinct before his girlfriend talked him out of it. He surrendered at the 77th Precinct on December 6, 2022. By the time of his surrender, NYPD detectives had been assembling evidence across 3 separate borough jurisdictions. The scale of the spree required coordination between multiple precincts, multiple detective squads, and the New York City District Attorney's offices in each of the boroughs where a crime had occurred. He was remanded to Rikers Island the following day. He has remained there since. What happened inside the jail complex over the next 2 years became a defining Rikers story of the 2024 and 2025 period. According to the president of the Correction Officers Benevolent Association, Benny Boschio Jr., Sundance Oliver assaulted roughly 50 civilian and uniformed staff members over the course of 2 years inside the complex. The attacks ranged from thrown objects to homemade weapons. The pattern held across multiple housing units and across shifts. Housing decisions around him were adjusted repeatedly. And in the internal record-keeping of the department, his name became one that officers on the tier flagged to each other before starting a shift. According to court filings from the Bronx District Attorney's Office, between January 23rd and May 30th of 2025, Oliver allegedly filled plastic bottles with feces and threw them at correction officers on at least 3 separate occasions. The most serious incident, though, came later that summer. On August 27, 2025, at a Rikers facility called the North Infirmary Command, Oliver started a fire inside his cell. As correction officers, including members of the department's emergency service unit, moved to evacuate the smoke-filled area, Oliver stepped out with a ceramic scalpel in his hand and slashed 2 of them as they approached. One officer required 17 stitches to his scalp. The other required 7 stitches to his face. Boschio described the attack publicly as the most violent assault on his union's members in years, and said the officers were lucky to be alive. So how does a system that already knows a detainee has attacked its staff dozens of times, and that has already indicted him for 2 deaths, still find itself with that same detainee unsupervised long enough to start a fire and pull a blade? On September 22, 2025, Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark announced an indictment against Oliver for the August scalpel attack. The charges included second-degree attempted murder, aggravated assault on a peace or police officer, and numerous other counts. Clark stated publicly that the attack had left one of the officers with a large and permanent scar. Oliver's next court date was scheduled for December 1, 2025. The underlying 2022 double homicide case against him, the deaths of Kevin Langston and Keira Rattray, has not yet gone to trial as of early 2026. He has approximately 11 open criminal cases in total, including open homicide cases in both Brooklyn and Manhattan. Each of those cases sits at a different stage in the court process. Prosecutors across 3 separate district attorney offices continue to handle the matters against him. As of 2026, Sundance Oliver remains at Rikers Island as a pretrial detainee. He has not been convicted of the 2022 double homicide charges. He has not been convicted of the August scalpel attack. He is being held without bail, and he has been placed under sustained monitoring from both the Bronx District Attorney's Office and the union representing correction officers. The case that follows involves a killing spree that lasted not years, but 28 hours, across 2 boroughs in the winter of 2011. Maxim Gelman. Over the course of 28 hours in February of 2011, a Ukrainian-born graffiti artist named Maxim Gelman crossed 2 New York City boroughs on a stabbing and vehicular rampage that left 4 people dead and 5 more wounded. By the end of it, he had killed his own stepfather, an acquaintance, her mother, and a pedestrian he had never met. He had also slashed a man on a moving subway train before that man fought back and helped bring him down. Gelman was arrested near Times Square, and when he arrived at Rikers Island for intake, he failed both the physical and the mental portion of the examination and was moved immediately to Bellevue Hospital's psychiatric ward. Maxim Gelman was in his early 20s at the time of the rampage. He was living in the Sheepshead Bay section of Brooklyn. In January of 2011, roughly a month before the killings, he had been arrested on a crack cocaine charge. He had a history of personal disputes with people in his life. He had also told some of the people around him that he believed federal drug enforcement agents were watching him. The rampage began late in the evening on February 11, 2011, and continued through the following day. According to prosecutors, Gelman argued with his stepfather, Alexander Kuznetsov, over the use of a Lexus that belonged to Gelman's mother. Kuznetsov was 54 years old. He was stabbed to death during the argument. Gelman then drove to the home of an acquaintance named Yelena Bulchenko, who was 20 years old, and waited inside her residence for hours before she returned. When she arrived home, he stabbed her 11 times. Her mother, Anna Bulchenko, was 56 years old, and she was also killed inside the home. Gelman then took the stolen car and drove into Manhattan, where he struck and killed a pedestrian named Stephen Tannenbaum, 62 years old, who happened to be walking in his path. The final incident of the rampage took place on a subway car heading through the Times Square station. Gelman slashed several riders. One of them, a subway rider named Joseph Lozito, was a martial arts fan. Lozito absorbed multiple wounds and physically restrained Gelman until police were able to make the arrest. If not for that intervention, the toll from the final incident could have been much higher. Lozito's account of the moment on the subway car would later be widely published. He described recognizing Gelman from earlier news reports on the killings, understanding that he was the person who had already left 4 people dead across the previous day, and making the decision to physically restrain him before more riders could be hurt. Gelman was taken into custody on February 12, 2011. He was processed toward Rikers Island. He failed both the medical and the psychiatric portions of the intake examination and was transferred to the Bellevue Hospital psychiatric ward, where he remained for the initial portion of his pretrial detention. During that period, and later from Rikers itself, he gave a series of erratic jailhouse interviews. In one of them, he claimed responsibility for 6 additional killings, a claim investigators looked into and ultimately dismissed after finding no cases that matched his descriptions. In another interview, he told reporters that he wanted to kill Levi Aaron, the man who had been accused around the same time in the death of a child in Brooklyn. A correction officer on the unit at one point warned the reporters not to get him agitated. So how does a case involving 4 killings across a single day, captured almost from beginning to end on witness accounts and surveillance footage, actually move through the New York court system? On November 30th, 2011, Gelman pleaded guilty in Brooklyn to 4 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, robbery, and assault. He entered those pleas without any deal. The court and his attorneys were both clear that there was no negotiation reducing the charges. On January 18, 2012, Acting Justice Vincent Del Giudice sentenced him to a term of 200 years to life. That total was reached by imposing consecutive terms of 25 years to life on each of the 4 murder counts, plus the maximum sentences on the other counts. Del Giudice, according to court records, called Gelman a pathologically violent predator and a sociopath. During the sentencing itself, Gelman staged an outburst that became widely covered in the New York press. He proposed marriage to the television personality Kim Kardashian from the courtroom. He cursed the judge. He directed statements at the families of his victims. His behavior in court was disruptive enough that reports from the day covered the outburst separately from the sentence itself. Photographs from the courtroom, statements from the families, and reporter accounts of the scene filled the front pages of the New York tabloids in the days that followed. The story had already been unusual because of the 28-hour timeline of the killings, and the sentencing itself pushed the case back onto the front pages for another week. That was not the end of his court proceedings. On February 15, 2012, in a separate Manhattan case related to the subway slashing of Joseph Lozito, Justice Richard Carruthers added a consecutive 25-year sentence for attempted murder. As of 2026, Maxim Gelman remains in the custody of the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. His combined sentences total 225 years to life, an amount that effectively precludes any possibility of parole. His specific current facility has not been confirmed in publicly available records. Several New York State maximum security prisons closed during 2024 and 2026, forcing multiple transfers across the system. Yelena Bulchenko was 20 years old. Alexander Kuznetsov was 54. Anna Bulchenko was 56. Stephen Tannenbaum was 62. Joseph Lozito recovered from his wounds and later spoke publicly about the day of the attack. This next name spans nearly 6 decades of criminal history and involves a killer whose crimes crossed multiple generations of New York State parole boards. Harvey Marcellin. Between 1963 and 2022, a span of nearly 6 decades, a single person walked out of the New York State prison system 3 separate times, and each time, another woman was killed. Her name was Harvey Marcellin. Marcellin was born in Harlem in 1938, has used the alternate name Marceline Harvey, and began transitioning in 1993, identifying as a woman since that point. And by the time Marcellin was returned to custody in 2022, the pattern was so clear that a Brooklyn judge would eventually state on the record that he had no doubt further killings would occur if the sentence allowed for parole. Harvey Marcellin was born on May 21, 1938, in Harlem, New York. Marcellin's criminal record dated back to the 1950s and included a September 1957 felony assault and a 1963 arrest for rape and attempted rape. A Bellevue psychiatric examination that same year described Marcellin's condition as a schizoid personality with sociopathic features and concluded that she was not criminally insane. The first killing took place on April 18, 1963. The victim was Marcelin's girlfriend at the time, a woman named Jacqueline Bonds. Bonds had been scheduled to appear that same day to provide an alibi for Marcelin in an unrelated assault case. She was shot to death inside a Manhattan apartment. Marcelin was convicted on October 16, 1963, of first-degree murder. The jury deadlocked on the death penalty, and Marcelin was sentenced to a term of 20 years to life. She was paroled in 1984, after serving 21 years inside the New York State prison system. The second killing came roughly a year after her release. The victim was another girlfriend, a woman named Ana Laura Serrera Miranda, sometimes rendered in court records as Ana Laura Sierra. Miranda was stabbed to death, and her body was found inside a garbage bag near Central Park in October of 1985. Marcelin pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a 12-year sentence. Following that term, Marcelin remained in state custody for several years on parole violations and other proceedings before being released again in 2019. In front of the parole board that June, she told the panel directly that she would not reoffend and gave her word on the point. Roughly 3 years later, the third killing took place. In early 2022, Marcelin murdered a 68-year-old woman named Susan Lydon. Lydon and Marcelin had known each other for approximately 2 years. They had stayed at the same Bronx homeless shelter together back in 2019. On March 4, 2022, a torso was discovered inside a rolling cart in the Cypress Hills area of Brooklyn. Investigators identified the remains as Lydon. When police searched Marcelin's apartment on Pennsylvania Avenue, they recovered additional remains, along with saws and bloody sheets. Store surveillance footage from days earlier captured Marcelin riding a motorized wheelchair while carrying part of the victim's body. Marcelin was arrested on March 4, 2022, and returned to Rikers Island for pretrial detention. She was initially placed in a male housing unit. She was later moved to the Rose M. Singer Center, the only women's facility on Rikers, a decision that drew immediate public controversy given her history of killing women. According to reporting later published in the New York Times and other outlets, a nurse at the Bronx shelter where Marcelin had met Lydon had raised concerns about her presence at the shelter in 2019. Those concerns, according to the reporting, had been overridden. A former social worker at the shelter later filed a lawsuit in December of 2022, claiming she had been fired after warning about the threat Marcelin posed to other residents. The lawsuit added a further layer to the public discussion. New York City agencies came under press scrutiny over their intake and placement decisions for a person with 2 prior killings of women on the record. The Department of Corrections' decision to house Marcelin at the Rose M. Singer Center remained the subject of ongoing public reporting throughout the pretrial period, with advocacy groups on multiple sides of the housing debate weighing in publicly. So how does a killer walk out of a state prison system 3 separate times over the course of nearly 6 decades and only face a life sentence on the third offense? Marcelin was indicted by Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez in March of 2022. The charges included second-degree murder, tampering with physical evidence, and concealment of a human corpse. The case moved slowly through the state court system over the next several years. A jury trial finally took place in the spring of 2026. After a trial lasting roughly 2 weeks, the jury deliberated for approximately 1 hour before returning a conviction. Because Marcelin had already been convicted of first-degree murder in 1963, the current case qualified under New York state law for a first-degree charge, and the jury returned guilty on that count. On June 10, 2026, Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Danny Chun sentenced Harvey Marcelin, then 88 years old, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chun stated on the record that the cold fact of the case was that every time Marcelin had been released, another woman had died. He added that if Marcelin were ever paroled again, he had no doubt she would kill again. Marcelin maintained innocence at sentencing, telling the court that the proceedings had been unfair. Chun's ruling ended a proceeding that had, in one sense, been building since 1963, the year of Marcelin's first killing. Across 4 separate decades, 3 parole board decisions had returned Marcelin to society. Each of those decisions had been made on the record available at the time. On the record available in 2026, Chun's judgment was that no further release would be considered. As of 2026, Harvey Marcelin is incarcerated inside the New York State prison system, serving a sentence with no possibility of release. The final name on this moves back to the Rikers Island complex itself, and to a Thanksgiving Day gang attack on a correction captain that was captured almost entirely on the jail's own surveillance cameras. Jason Reed. On the afternoon of Thanksgiving Day, 2017, inside a Rikers Island housing area at the Otis Bantam Correctional Center, a captain in the New York City Department of Correction named Awais Gowri was jumped by 3 inmates and pulled to the floor. He fought back. He briefly pinned one of the attackers before being jumped again. A female correction officer arrived on the scene and came to his aid. 2 other captains who had been in the same area fled instead of intervening. The whole incident had been building for 3 weeks, and the ringleader of the attack had spent much of the morning on the jail's own surveillance cameras, gathering a group of roughly 14 fellow inmates before the assault began. The ringleader was a 33-year-old inmate named Jason Reed. He used the alias Chuck. He was a member of the Bloods gang, and he was originally from the Bronx. At the time of the Thanksgiving attack, Reed was in pretrial detention at Rikers on a separate home invasion and robbery case. The origin of the attack, according to court filings and reporting, dated back 3 weeks earlier to a separate incident on November 2, 2017. On that day, Captain Gowri had used pepper spray to break up an inmate fight inside a Rikers housing unit. Reed had been one of the inmates involved in the fight. Following the spray, Reed had threatened Gowri directly, telling the captain that he would cut him. That threat became public knowledge inside the jail, and it circulated among the general population in the weeks that followed. On the morning of Thanksgiving Day, November 23, 2017, surveillance cameras inside the Otis Bantam Correctional Center captured Reed gathering approximately 14 inmates at around 12:15 in the afternoon. The footage showed him moving among them, having conversations, and coordinating. Roughly 90 minutes after that gathering, Reed led the actual attack on Gowri. According to a press release later issued by Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark, Reed slammed Gowri to the floor and began punching him. 2 other inmates joined in almost immediately. Gowri fought back and at one point briefly pinned Reed down before being pulled off and jumped again by additional attackers. A female correction officer arrived on the scene and physically engaged the group to help extract Gowri from the pile. 2 other captains who had been in the general area of the incident reportedly fled the scene rather than intervening. Those 2 captains were later suspended. Gowri suffered bruises, cuts, and a wound approximately 3 inches long under his left ear. He was transported off the island for treatment. The public statements from the Bronx District Attorney's Office in the days that followed framed the case not just as an assault on a single captain, but as a broader statement about the culture inside the jail complex. Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark said publicly that the case presented what she described as a chilling picture of a society of violence inside Rikers, in which gang members had come to believe they controlled the facilities. She added that the inmates did not, in fact, run the jails. So what happens when a coordinated attack on a captain, captured on the jail's own cameras and involving over a dozen inmates, actually moves from the housing unit into a Bronx courtroom. On December 14, 2017, 15 inmates were indicted on gang assault and robbery charges related to the Thanksgiving Day attack. The potential sentence on those charges reached up to 25 years for a conviction at trial. Reed pleaded guilty in February of 2018. His sentencing was initially set for a date shortly afterward, but was postponed after Reed reported that he was ill. It was rescheduled for April of 2018. At that April sentencing, Reed received a term of 8 years for the Captain attack. According to court records and reporting from that period, Reed was also expected to receive an additional 1 1/3 to 3-year term for a separate assault at Rikers, and a 10-year term for the underlying home invasion case. The specific structure of how those combined sentences were ordered to run against each other has not been fully confirmed in publicly available reporting. The aftermath for Captain Gowrie was mixed. Following the attack, he received departmental commendations for valor and awards from elected officials for his conduct during the incident. He was assigned to the Department of Corrections' Elite Special Operations Division. He was also given a temporary detail at the New York City Department of Investigation. Then, in June of 2023, roughly 5.5 years after the Thanksgiving attack, Captain Gowrie, a decorated 10-year veteran of the department, was suspended by the Department of Correction. According to reporting from the New York Daily News and Corrections Insight, the suspension came shortly after Gowrie had emailed his superiors to raise safety concerns about a different mentally ill detainee at Rikers who had allegedly assaulted 32 correction officers in a 6-month span. Gowrie's attorney at the time, a former inspector general named Serena Townsend, publicly described the suspension as retaliatory in nature. The situation added a further layer to what had already become a widely reported personal history. A captain who had physically survived a coordinated gang attack on Thanksgiving Day, and who had continued to publicly raise concerns about staff safety in the years that followed. The current status of Jason Reed inside the New York State prison system as of 2026 has not been publicly confirmed in available reporting. His combined sentences from the 2018 proceedings could have expired by the early 2020s if pretrial credit and standard release provisions applied. But the additional home invasion sentence could keep him incarcerated. A direct New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision inmate lookup would be needed to confirm his current facility and release status. Every one of these cases came out of the same jail complex, and every one of them left officers with stories that outlasted the sentences. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.